something happened this morning that I do not think most people have fully absorbed yet. Donald Trump just announced what he is calling a triple force minesweeping commitment for the Strait of Hormuz. The coverage is treating this as escalation, as American resolve, as proof that Washington will not let Iran close that waterway. I want to argue the exact opposite. What happened this morning is not a show of force. It is a show of dependency. And the most important reaction to Trump's statement did not come from Tehran. It came from Beijing, and that reaction was silence. That silence is not passive. That silence is structural. And I want to explain to you why that silence, more than any missile system, more than any naval deployment, tells Iran that the game Trump thinks he is playing is not the game that is actually being played right now. Let me be very clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying Trump's announcement does not matter. I am not saying minesweeping capability is irrelevant. What I am saying is this: if you think the story this morning is about American military capacity, you are watching the wrong story. The story is about who holds the infrastructure that makes that capacity politically usable. And the answer to that question is not in Washington. It is in Beijing. The triple force announcement looks like strength. But when you understand the full picture, when you understand what China built over the last decade, when you understand why Beijing said nothing this morning, you start to see that what Trump announced is not a deterrent. It is a request that only works if China allows it to work. And China has not said yes. Here's my thesis. Trump's minesweeping commitment is being read as unilateral American power projection. That reading is wrong. What Trump actually announced this morning is a capability that requires Chinese logistical permission, Chinese energy tie-dye cooperation, and Chinese strategic restraint to function without triggering a global oil crisis. The triple force sounds independent. It is not. It is structurally dependent on Beijing's willingness to either flood the market with reserve crude, reroute supply chains, or signal to Tehran that escalation will cost Iranian access to its largest oil customer. China has done none of those things, and that is not an accident. That is a choice. And that choice tells Iran something very specific. You are not alone, and America's minesweeping announcement does not change the structure of this confrontation. Let me walk you through what actually happened this morning and why the exact sequencing matters. At approximately 9 a.m. Eastern Time, the White House released a statement saying that the United States is committing what it calls a triple force minesweeping operation for Hormuz. That means 3 separate naval minesweeping task groups, rotational deployment, 24-hour coverage, with stated readiness to clear any mining attempt within 72 hours of detection. The statement says this is to guarantee freedom of navigation. It says this is to reassure allies. It says this is non-negotiable. Within 2 hours, the statement was amplified by the Secretary of Defense, who added that this commitment includes not just U.S. Navy assets, but coordination with British and French mine-sweeping units, plus what he called regional partner support. The coverage immediately framed this as coalition resolve. CNN called it a red line. Fox called it Trump taking control. The defense analysts on cable news spent the morning explaining minesweeping technology, talking about sonar, talking about drone boats, talking about how quickly the U.S. can reopen a waterway. Here's what did not happen. Beijing did not issue a statement. Beijing did not call it escalation. Beijing did not call it stabilization. Beijing said nothing. And I want you to understand, when Beijing says nothing after an announcement like this, that silence is not neutral. That silence is a signal. And the signal is this: we are not playing the game you just announced. Now let me show you why that silence is the story, not the minesweeping commitment. The reason China's silence matters is because Trump's announcement only works if Beijing cooperates in 3 specific ways. Let me break them down. First, oil substitution. If Iran mines Hormuz and the U.S. sweeps it, the disruption window is still 72 hours minimum, possibly 2 weeks, if Iran uses sophisticated pressure mines or continuous reseeding. During that window, roughly 17 million barrels per day of Gulf crude stop moving. That is 17% of global supply. The only entity on Earth with the spare capacity and reserve release authority to prevent price shock during that window is China. China holds 157.7 million barrels in strategic reserve. China controls supply agreements with Russia, Kazakhstan, and Venezuela that can be accelerated. If Beijing does not flood the market during a Hormuz closure, oil hits $140, maybe $160 per barrel within a week. That price breaks Trump's political economy at home. It breaks European coalition support. It makes the minesweeping operation politically unsustainable, even if it is technically successful. Second, Iranian economic leverage. The reason Iran can tolerate a minesweeping threat is because China buys 1.3 million barrels per day of Iranian crude, sanctions or no sanctions. That revenue is what funds Iran's ability to sustain a Hormuz confrontation. If Beijing signals to Tehran that mining Hormuz will cost Iranian access to Chinese markets, that changes Iran's calculus immediately. But if Beijing says nothing, if Beijing keeps buying, then Iran knows the economic cost of escalation is manageable. Trump's minesweeping capability does not change that calculation. Only Beijing's position does. Third, diplomatic cover. The Triple Force announcement only holds together as a coalition move if Beijing either endorses it or stays neutral in the Security Council. If China calls it unilateral aggression, if China vetoes any resolution legitimizing minesweeping as self-defense, then the legal and diplomatic architecture collapses. The operation still happens, but it happens as American unilateralism, not as international norm enforcement. That distinction matters for European participation. It matters for Gulf state support. It matters for how the rest of the world reads American power. Trump's announcement this morning assumed Chinese cooperation in all three of those domains. Beijing's silence this morning said, "We have not agreed to any of that." Now let me pull the lens back and show you the historical pattern that explains why this moment is so dangerous. What Trump announced this morning is not new. The structure of this confrontation is old. It is Suez 1956 flipped. And if you understand Suez, you understand why China's silence is the most important fact in this story. In 1956, Britain and France believed they could retake the Suez Canal through military force and that the United States would either support them or stay neutral. They were wrong. The US did not stay neutral. Washington used economic pressure, threatened the British pound, and forced a withdrawal. Why? Because the US knew that unilateral military action without superpower alignment would fracture the Western alliance and create a vacuum that the Soviet Union could exploit. Britain and France learned that military capability without structural support is not power. It is exposure. What Trump announced this morning is the mirror image. He is assuming that China will either support American minesweeping or stay neutral, because it is in China's economic interest to keep oil flowing. That assumption is the same mistake Britain and France made. It assumes that the other superpowers' interests align with yours. It assumes that your capability is enough. It is not. Here's what China sees. China sees an America that is trying to manage Hormuz without Chinese buy-in. China sees a US that thinks it can threaten minesweeping and that Tehran will back down because American naval power is superior. But China also sees something else. China sees that the US cannot sustain a Hormuz confrontation without Chinese energy cooperation. And that means the real leverage is not in the Gulf. It is in Beijing, and Beijing knows it. I call this the confidence ladder. Every escalation that America announces without securing Chinese structural support is another step up a ladder where the only way down is Chinese permission. The minesweeping announcement this morning is not the bottom rung. It is 3 rungs up. And every rung higher makes the US more dependent on Beijing's choice to either stabilize the situation or let it spiral. Now let me show you how this plays out in Tehran and in the Gulf capitals, because this is where the silence turns into strategy. Iran watches Beijing very carefully. Iranian oil ministers, Iranian military planners, Iranian Supreme National Security Council members all understand that their ability to confront the US in Hormuz depends on one thing: China's willingness to keep buying Iranian crude and to prevent a global price collapse that would force Tehran to capitulate. When Trump announces a minesweeping commitment and Beijing says nothing, Tehran does not read that as Chinese neutrality. Tehran reads that as Chinese permission. Let me be specific. If Beijing had wanted to deter Iranian escalation, the statement this morning would have been immediate. It would have said, China supports freedom of navigation in Hormuz. China calls on all parties to de-escalate. China is coordinating with international partners to ensure energy stability. That statement does not require Beijing to endorse Trump. It just requires Beijing to signal that Iranian escalation will cost Iranian access to Chinese markets. Beijing did not make that statement. And that silence tells Tehran, you still have room to maneuver. Now look at the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, they all want Hormuz open. They all depend on that shipping lane. But they also know that if Hormuz closes and the US tries to reopen it without Chinese energy stabilization, the price spike will be catastrophic. The The Gulf states do not want a minesweeping operation that triggers a 2-week closure and $150 oil. They want a diplomatic solution that prevents mining in the first place. And the only actor who can deliver that solution is China, because only China has the leverage to make Tehran reconsider. Trump's announcement this morning did not give the Gulf states confidence. It gave them a new problem: how to manage an American commitment that does not include the one actor whose cooperation actually matters. So what does this morning's announcement actually reveal? It reveals 3 things. First, it reveals that American military capability in the Gulf is real, but that it is no longer structurally independent. The U.S. can sweep mines. The U.S. can patrol the strait. The U.S. can project force. But the U.S. cannot manage the global economic consequences of Hormuz escalation without Chinese cooperation. That is new. That was not true in 1990. That was not true in 2003. It is true now. Second, it reveals that China has built a position where silence is power. Beijing does not have to threaten. Beijing does not have to escalate. Beijing just has to stay quiet, and that quiet tells every other actor in this system that the American announcement is incomplete. This is what I call silent veto. China is not blocking the minesweeping operation. China is just refusing to provide the infrastructure that makes it politically sustainable, and that refusal delivered through silence is enough. Third, it reveals that Trump is now operating in a game where his announcements require Beijing's validation to be credible. That is a fundamental shift in the structure of American power. It does not mean America is weak. It means American strength is now conditional on Chinese choices in ways that it was not a decade ago. And if you do not understand that conditionality, you do not understand what happened this morning. So here is what I am watching now. I am watching whether Beijing breaks its silence in the next 48 hours. If Beijing issues a statement supporting freedom of navigation or calling for de-escalation, that tells you China is choosing to stabilize. If Beijing stays silent for another 3 days, that tells you China is giving Iran more time. I am watching Iranian oil exports. If Chinese tanker traffic to Iranian ports stays steady or increases, that is a signal that Beijing is not pressuring Tehran. And I am watching the Gulf states. If Saudi Arabia or UAE start pushing for direct China-mediated talks with Iran, that tells you they have concluded that Trump's minesweeping commitment is not enough. The larger question is this: can America still manage global choke points unilaterally, or does every major choke point now require Chinese structural buy-in? Trump announced a minesweeping operation this morning as if it were a unilateral decision, but the structure of the situation says it is not unilateral. It is conditional, and the condition is Chinese cooperation. Beijing's silence this morning said, "We have not agreed to cooperate." That silence is not background noise. That silence is the answer. And if you are in Tehran, that silence tells you that you are not as isolated as the minesweeping announcement wants you to believe. Push back on this if you see it differently. But if the structure is what I think it is, the next 72 hours will show you very clearly who actually holds the infrastructure that makes Trump's announcement either credible or hollow.